So which armies in Warhammer 40k are looking strongest and weakest right now? Let's talk through each one of them, how they seem to be getting on with the statistics, and what good players are choosing to put on the table with them right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Warhammer 40k armies and win rates, doing a big roundup of every faction in the game, how they're doing right now and why. 40k had a fairly massive update in December with a big balanced data slate and a massive amount of new content for the game in those new Grotmus detachments, though since then we've now had a good 5 to 6 weeks worth of tournament data from factions in open conflict with each other, including a few really big tournaments that help separate the wheat from the chaff a little bit, things like the Las Vegas Open and the Nottingham Super Major. There's plenty of good places out there that track 40k statistics from all these events, things like Meta Monday, StatCheck 40k, Den of Fools including some RTT data, and Goonhammer and Brest Coast pairings can be particularly good for finding some army lists. Now that there's been a few weeks data to establish themselves, it looks like we can be a little bit more confident as to how the factions are getting on, some definite trends as to some factions that are struggling, some that seem to be very strong right now, and a fair bunch in the middle that are doing alright. For talking through army strength in 40k, I generally like to go through in terms of win rate order, as I think that's the statistic that's most relevant to most people out there, representing an average player turning up to a tournament with a list that isn't terrible, and how many wins and losses they can expect. Obviously it doesn't really give the entire picture, it can be skewed by a whole bunch of things including the types of players that play the faction, and there's certainly lots of armies that have lowish win rates that can still be some of the best things on the top tables with a specific build played by an expert player. I think it's a rough and ready helpful metric to determine army strength. Otherwise, to add a bit of context as well, we'll also take a look at the number of big tournament wins. That gives a bit more information as to what's doing well at the absolute top levels of play, and also the percentage of players making it to the top tables with either one loss or none at all. Again, that maybe shows the sort of armies that might be towards the top level of 40k in terms of competitive play. Finally, the actual play rates of each faction as well maybe show a bit of enthusiasm. They depend on how widely the army is collected, though it's certainly interesting to take a look if certain factions are being played more or less than normal. In general though, 40k game balance remains as it's been for a fair amount of time now, compared with the vast majority of its past history, far better than normal. Pretty much every faction can compete in some way, and player skill and army list choice tends to be a bigger factor versus the exact choice of faction. That's particularly true at a casual level as well. There's a pretty huge amount of factions that are clustered around the mid-tier, which is kind of good to see. Plenty of factions use multiple different detachments on the go. And in terms of raw win rates, there's only a few things that are outside of Games Workshop's normal target of around 45 to 55% wins, though it does look like there's a few choice detachments that are also breaking that as well though. In general though, on the whole, 40k game balance is good compared with its past, and way better than say the start of 10th when it was pretty abysmal. Jumping into it though, let's talk through the armies in turn and put them on the big graph. And first up we'll start with the weakest armies in the game, and at the moment it looks like these are Imperial Agents and the Battle Sisters of the Adepta Sororitas. The Imperial Agents still aren't really 100% clear if Games Workshop intend for them to actually compete with the rest as well. They've been completely neglected in balance passes so far, and the data for them is so limited it's not really worth putting them on the chart for their win rates. The Sisters on the other hand got some spectacular nerfs from being in a position where they were fairly well balanced last update, just bad news on multiple different fronts, and that seems to have pushed them far below the performance of any other faction right now. As we go along, let's put them on the big graph. I've put the Sisters here, though as mentioned the Imperial Agents aren't getting a place due to having far too little data. Starting with the Agents, they're pretty much the single faction that has the most trouble right now. Probably the most meaningful statistic of them is that they're by far the least played army in the game, and by a very wide margin as well. The next lowest played faction still has around about 8 times the amount of players that take them to grand tournaments as these, both due to the fact that they're sort of a new and cobbled together faction, and also just don't really seem to compete on a normal level. It looks like just 9 players took them to grand tournaments in 2025 so far, which is spectacularly low, so it just means that the win rates only really show how they got on. It does seem that they had a 53% win rate for grand tournaments, though given the low sample size, the real number for that, if we had loads more data, could still be one of the weakest factions in the game. I had a look at the RTT data from Den of Fools, which looks like they're more around 46% or so, but even that looks like it's a ridiculously low sample size of 80 odd games. In general, since they came out, the Imperial Agents just haven't really functioned properly as their own standalone army. They don't get a core detachment rule and don't really have any units in their core codex that can take down enemy monsters or vehicles, meaning that they're reliant on doing sort of board control movement shenanigans things with Imperial fleets. Most of their squads are kind of okay for what they do, though not really standout, and they have an overabundance of sort of chaff skirmish infantry. In the last balance update, Games Workshop didn't really give them anything. I guess Allied Armiger Warglaves going down 10 points isn't the most unhelpful in the world, though otherwise their Collector's Assassin close drop was made a little bit worse, so bad news for one of the assassins, and also the new assassin detachment from the Grotmus detachments was possibly one of the weakest ones out of any of them. In terms of stronger units, the Imperialis fleet list tend to build around the Voidfarers, doing some movement shenanigans with Navy Breachers or Rogue Traders. Though for other stuff, Inquisitor Draxus is a fairly efficient leader. The Assassins are nice enough to have one or two of, given that you can swap between them. For damage dealers in the Codex, it'd be Deathwatch Veterans or the Grey Knights mainly. And for anti-tank heavy lifting, you might need some Allied Knights on the go. Generally, if Games Workshop want them to actually compete on the same level as the other armies, they certainly need something. An army rule would be a start at least, and ideally one that helps them out with their biggest weakness being able to take down tough stuff. I've seen people propose something like an ordnance bombardment or something could be fun. It kind of remains to be seen whether or not they're actually going to be treated as a proper faction for Games Workshop to balance though. Otherwise, for seemingly weakest armies in Warhammer 40k, we have the Sisters of Battle. They dropped down to 41% wins, which is minus 9% from previous, where they were fairly well balanced. Haven't won any big tournaments since the balance update. They're the second least played faction, despite having really quite good player rate numbers before, and don't seem to be having much success breaking into the top tables. 11% of players just losing one game or going undefeated, which puts them 20th out of their factions there. Sisters get their Acts of Faith for Miracle Dice to sub into big rolls, and tend to do a lot of damage with big hitting melter weapons. Previously it was Bringers of Flame that tended to be the competitive way to run them, but in the last updates they've got kind of wrecked on all angles. Points increases for the Castigator and Exorcist, which were both good. The Armour of Contempt nerf hit Bringers of Flame. Miracle Dice were basically cut in half in terms of the number that you have of them. The Bringers of Flame detachment were nerfed in another 4 different ways as well. Lots of stratagems and core rules got a bit worse, and when they gained the Champions of Faith detachment for the Grotmus things, that one's unusually dependent on Miracle Dice, which you now have less of. As a result, it does seem that Sisters players have indeed struggled to make things work. For competitive detachments being run, as suspected there has been a big pivot toward Hallowed Martyrs, which is the most commonly played now. That makes up just over half of Sisters' lists played in grand tournaments, with others being experimenting with a good variety of the rest. For standout units, Varl and Paragon Warsuits are still monstrously dangerous, even if they're not super tough, and Varl and Cananesses and Palatines can get on well with the character things of Hallowed Martyrs. Castigators are still pretty good between their firepower and utility. Regular Battle Sister squads are nice to have around, and Immolators to split them into small efficient units. And most of the other stuff is usable in the right detachment, but just overall the army is lacking for strength right now. Obviously having a bunch of problems currently, despite having an interesting codex that was pretty well received when it came out. GW could probably do with backtracking on a bunch of the special rules, to be honest. In particular, the Miracle Dice one just felt like a change that didn't really need to happen. And basically this entire raft of changes just felt like it was sort of taken from before the last points update, when Sisters were kind of overly strong. To be honest, it feels like you could literally revert every single thing that they did in the last balance update, and they'd probably emerge decently well balanced. Moving on though, in terms of win rate performance, the next factions in 40k are all a bit solidly better than the Sisters. These are the ones that are ranked on 45 or 46% win rates. Even these ones at least somewhat close to the mid-tier, and within Games Workshop's previously stated targets of around 45 to 55% wins, which they've said in the past. And just because they have a low win rate doesn't necessarily mean they can't do well at grand tournaments. Chaos Space Marines in particular seem to have been bucking the trend there. In any case, the armies that we have here are Tau Empire and Chaos Knights on 45%, and then Black Templars, Chaos Marines and Dark Angels on 46%. Going through those, and first up we have the Tau Empire. Their win rates at 45%, dropping down a big 4% from pre-update it seems. But despite that, good players have still been doing alright with them on the top tables of tournaments, 4 event wins or 5-0 undefeated runs. 15% of players make it into the top tables, which puts them at 11th out of the 27 factions there, and they're still being played quite a lot at grand tournaments, 11th out of the 27 factions there also. The last balance update in December largely kept them at least fairly similar to how they were before. There was just one annoyance for them with the 3-inch drop stratagem for Retaliation Cadre, meaning that you can't get within 6 inches out of the deep strike for their fusion blasters anymore. Even if they did go on to subsequently improve the range of their detachment rule up to 9 inches, so you could still get the AP bit at least. Otherwise they also gained the Allied Auxiliary Cadre detachment, which I think someone's already taken to win a grand tournament so far. But it basically seems that Tau have some of the best internally balanced detachments out of virtually any army in 40k. Pretty much every one of them being used in fairly good numbers. The crew's still more niche given that you have to have a lot of them to use that. It does seem that Retaliation Cadre has been doing worse since the 3-inch deep strike change. I don't know if that might pick up a bit due to the extra range on the AP thing now though. For their units, they have their coordinated fire with things marking and spotting for each other, often big rerolls from stealth suits on their big guns, and again tower fairly well balanced with the vast majority of their units being usable in one form or another. Commanders and crisis suit combos often interesting, devilfish breaches in Carrion or Montcar, and most lists are backed up by some big scary anti-tank guns, things like hammerheads, skyrays, broadsides, the fairly tough and sturdy riptide for the front line, and the ghost kill to be able to lurk away with lone operative but still contribute to fire. Kroot might be in a bit more niche supporting roles outside of their dedicated detachment, but they're pretty effective for a bunch of their units in auxiliary cadre or the hunting pack. Overall, seems like the average tower player is still struggling to use them just a little bit more than most armies out there in 40k though. I wouldn't be too surprised if this did wind up picking up with a few more weeks data, but I guess we'll see. I guess they did have one direct nerf to perhaps their best attachment in the retaliation cadre, though it still doesn't really seem to stop good tower players from taking top spots at tournaments. They often do tend to be one of the armies that can be a little bit higher skill to use when they're well balanced, just due to managing pushing up with fragile shooting units to score points and gain lines of sight versus exposing too much and getting things wiped out too early. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in the Magnet Baron. They're a US based supplier of all things neodymium, and make sure they have good quality high strength M52 magnets, making sure that they come from good quality sources. I certainly make good use of magnets myself in my own hobby. Some kits like Tau battlesuits, Lehman Russ battle tanks or Imperial Knights can be pretty great to have them on, just so you can swap out all the loadouts and change things up, either game to game or when Games Workshop changes the rules. For their things, they've got a whole bunch of specific kit-tailored products like this Questoris Knight kit. This one comes with a whole bunch of 3D printed components, so it means that you can magnetize up an entire knight without having to do any drilling for it, and there's some handy tutorials to follow along with. They've got a massive amount of other stuff as well, such as these flight stand bundles. I'll talk through a few more of their other interesting things towards the end of the video. Basically, if you want to magnetize something for wargaming things though, they're likely to be able to help you out. In any case though, a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. You'll find them links down below in the description. Moving onwards with the 40k armies though, next up we have the Chaos Knights. Win rates are around 45%, and again falling a bit from the previous update, minus 4% from where they were. They've had the one big tournament win or 5-0 run. They played 19th out of the 27 factions out there, and seem to be one of the very lowest for reaching the top tables at 26th out of the 27 factions. It maybe seems a little bit surprising that they've fallen off a good amount, given that broadly they got buffs from the last balance update. They had some very small points decreases on the Stalker, Huntsman and Executioner, plus some enhancement swaps, and their core rule for extra damage and defense for their army for battle shock things functioning earlier, and some enhancements being able to key into that a bit more. They also had that Iconoclast Fiefdom detachment turn up, which is the one where you can feed your allied cultists into Gatling cannons to make them shoot harder, though it still seems that the vast majority of people are playing with a Traitorous Lance, even if that other detachment is kind of fun. Otherwise, broadly speaking, they're still doing what they were normally doing, usually mass war dogs with a whole bunch of those savage war dog carnivores and shooty war dog brigands on the table, maybe a few more stalkers or huntsmen than before. Moving out very quickly to deal a whole bunch of damage, and having battle shock shenanigans for factions that care about it, and usually their lists tend to be supported by a good amount of allied demons, often nurglings for the midfield, maybe individual beasts to deep strike with some secondary things, perhaps plague bearers for sticky objectives, and some lists have been using Rotigus to just have a really big tanky demon to go alongside the rest. After a few waves of points cuts, several of the big knights are usable enough, though it still seems that they're broadly maybe choices, and usually just maybe one of them at max, only a few lists daring to run more. Overall, it does look like they've fallen off on win rate just a little bit. I wouldn't be too surprised if they move up a bit more towards the midfield with more data, though I guess we'll see. It's certainly been getting a bit old for a while that the War Dogs are still the focus of the list. That has been the case pretty much since the faction came out, and that's been kind of annoyingly consistent for a long time now. Next up, and very slightly higher on 46% wins, are the Black Templars, and that's around where they were prior to the last update. It looks like they've won a couple of grand tournaments or placed 5-0 at them since that came out, are one of the more low-played factions of 40k at 21st out of the 27 factions, and are less likely to make the top tables than most, only 10% of players doing so, which puts them 24th there. In general, between all that, it does look like they're struggling more than many of the other Divergent chapters. In the last update, the biggest things were all the Space Marine changes that they had, the nerf to Armour of Contempt, and all the changes to the various Space Marine datasheets, and you can make some weird Templar armies that issue all the Templar datasheets but still use Righteous Crusaders, and then get the boosted +1 to wound Oath of Moment if you really want to. Finally, they also gained the Grotmus detachment in the Wrathful Procession, though it seems that one's broadly been ignored really, and the vast majority of people are using Righteous Crusaders, as it just had perhaps some slightly more overt benefits in the big Feel No Pain and the nice melee stratagems with extra AP, stopping enemies from falling back, and that 10 Houses Bones enhancement for some extra Feel No Pain for a big scary squad. The Wrathful Procession just seemed to be kind of similar sort of lines, but just a bit worse in terms of outright power, and it really doesn't seem to have taken off. For their datasheets, it feels like most of their stuff is usable enough, but after a whole bunch of nerfs, not really as much feels anywhere near as standout as it used to. Sword Brethren and either Hellbrecht or an Emperor's Champion will still hit incredibly hard, being able to delete most normal size units in the game without question, and the Templar Impulsors with their bolt-on multi-melters can be a nice way to deliver them. Big Crusader squads with Grimaldus or the 10 Houses Bones can be interesting. I've seen a few people run some smaller Crusader squads as well, now that you pay the tax on the bigger 20-man units, and they can also have a slightly weirdly hard-hitting tank force with multi-melters if you want to go that way. Overall, it's not really any big surprise that they haven't really moved much since the balance update. It does feel like the core Codex Astartes gained a lot compared with them with their boosted Oath of Moment and things. And I feel like they don't compare absolutely amazingly to the Space Wolves either, who have got very similar detachment rules in their Champions of Rust one. Still not awful though, and plenty of people are making them work. 46% isn't really all that far behind the curve. Moving on, we've got the Heretic Astartes of the Chaos Space Marines. They're also on 46% wins, which is -3 from pre-update, though it seems that perhaps unlike the Black Templars, they're just doing unusually well at the top of big tournaments. They've had either 6 event wins or 5-0 undefeated runs since the balance update, so quite a lot of success there. They're still being played in good numbers at 8th out of the 27 factions, though they aren't doing quite as well on breaking onto the top tables for the average player. Again, only 10% there, or 22nd out of the 27 factions. Kind of interesting enough stats there. Again, it also implies that the average player with them is finding them a bit harder to do well with than most. There are a few Chaos Lords and Commanders out there are taking them to great heights. The last balance update for them had the Armour of Contempt nerf for Renegade Raiders and Veterans of the Long War, which I think was relevant enough, particularly with their enjoyment of Vindicators. But they also seem to have added in the Creations of Bile, which looks like it's taken over as the most popularly played competitive detachment. The one where you get 2 random buffs out of a big table, so various ways to make your melee infantry really quite dangerous and fast across the board. And the Creations of Bile seems to do well to support from melee rush lists such as Possessed or a whole bunch of elites jumping out of rhinos and things, which I think is a playstyle that quite a lot of Chaos players enjoy. Otherwise, for detachments in competitive play, it looks like Renegade Raiders are the next most popular, then the Pact-Bound Zealots and Veterans of the Long War after that. In general, it looks like the Creations of Bile are having the best performance out of those though, and there are still a few people making Chaos Cult work. For stronger units, Chaos Space Marines have got plenty of staples. Chosen or Legionaries with Chaos Lords jumping out of rhinos tend to be good wherever they are. Cultists are hard to pass up for the sticky objectives. Allied Nurglings are handy to screen the midboard. Bikers are very efficient. Maybe some combination of Vindicators, Obliterators or Predators for some nice heretical fire support. And you can do big synergy things with Abaddon and Hellbrutes if you want to, though it is quite a big commitment in points. The Creations lists generally take Bile and then a bunch of melee goodness on the side. Overall at the moment it still looks like the average player with Chaos Space Marines is having a bit more trouble, though Creations of Bile looks like the best bet and is certainly doing well at the top of tournaments. I guess the rest of the detachments weren't helped out too much by the Armour of Contempt style changes, and plenty of datasheets do feel a little bit on the costly side, given they tend to pay a bit of a premium for their damage output with all the Dark Pacts and sustained unlethal hits on the go. Finally for this section we have Dark Angels at 46%, unchanged from pre-update once again. They've got 3 event wins or 5-0 undefeated runs since the balance update, so certainly not awful performance there. Maybe a little bit more likely to be breaking into the top tables at 13%, and I played kind of middling at grand tournaments in terms of player numbers. Like the Black Templars and the other Divergent chapters, they got a whole raft of changes from the core Codex Space Marine changes, the Armour of Contempt nerf, and the various buffs to a bunch of things, maybe Outriders being particularly popular for them. They were also hit by the Gladius Fire Discipline nerf though, as that was the detachment they were using most often in competitive play before. Otherwise they had a bunch of other stuff too. The Company of Hunters, Samael and Black Knights all got some improvements. The Lion got a bit pricier but got some damage to sweeps, making him better against elite infantry, and they got their Lion's Blade detachment, though unfortunately while a bunch of people have been experimenting with that one, it doesn't look like it's had the same amount of success as say Gladius has. Overall in tournaments it looks like most people are still running the Gladius Task Force, nice support for their fighting melee elites, moving faster and hitting harder when they get there. It looks like Stormlance has taken over as the second most popular detachment for Dark Angels now. I guess their foot melee also enjoys the advance and charge, and that can help their Outriders and Black Knights and attached characters. Otherwise, for efficient units, Azrael is still huge value with his command point farming and other stuff. Both Deathwing Knights and Inner Circle Companions are intimidating melee units, the Inner Circle maybe with a Judiseer for some fights first, or perhaps a Librarian. The line is pricier but still really solid and scary, very hard to deal with if you've got a melee army and he fights first. And it is nice to see a few more Ravenwing units and lists being run around, Outriders and Black Knights being put on the table in anger a bit more regularly. It's still maybe a bit disappointing to see their unique Dark Angels detachments still being seen as the underpowered thing versus the core codex though. It feels like they're probably due another round of improvements and things to try and get them up to that level. It looks like out of their unique detachments, Company of Hunters is maybe having the most success at the moment with the Ravenwing stuff. There's still a few of their unique characters which I feel like could probably go down by 5 points or 10 points or so. It does feel like mainly the Lion and Azrael and then the rest. Moving onwards and upwards very slightly to perhaps the more mid-tier factions of 40k. These are all armies that are just below the 50% midpoint, maybe a little bit more lower mid than upper mid, though in reality there's not all that much between them. It's really nice to see quite so many armies that neither look to be enormously too strong or too weak. Most of these are kind of doing fine for top tournament kind of placements. Maybe the biggest exception is the Orks that have taken in a huge amount of tournament victories. In any case, putting them on the chart, here we have Space Wolves at 47% wins, Thousand Sons and Orks at 48, and then Aeldari, Leagues of Votann, World Eaters, Genestealer Cults and Admech all at 49. Going through those though, and next up we have our next Divergent Space Marine chapter in the Space Wolves, 47% win rates, so down 3% from the 50% they were before. They've won one tournament or gone 5-0 undefeated so far, are one of the most niche factions in the game with 24th out of 27 in terms of play rate. I'd guess that there's a fair amount of people that just aren't really that interested in collecting them until they get their expected range update really. And they don't seem to be making their way into the top tables very regularly, at 10% there, so 21st out of the 27 factions. Again, for the last balance changes, it was mainly Space Marine stuff. They had a few unique Space Wolf things, such as Wolfen going up 5 points, and their Wolf Scouts gaining some AP on their combat blades, but not much besides that. For their competitive detachments, it still remains the Stormlance Task Force and the Champions of Russ, though the Champions are being more popular out of the two. The Stormlance, as ever, gives great buffs to mounted things, so it's great for their Thunderwolf spam, really long fast charges, and being extra tanky to enemy shooting and more. And then Champions of Russ is just very nice general purpose melee in the first place, a 6+ feel no pain across your army unless you want some damage, a bunch of good melee support stratagems, and then hopefully some of your many characters can trigger some of the other army-wide sagas to become active, so you can have a monstrously dangerous army by the end of the game. Unfortunately, their Grotmus detachment just wasn't really considered to be on the same level as the rest of that, and just isn't really very strong. For their powerful units, still loads of lists are using a good amount of Thunderwolves, often 6 of them with a Battle Leader and a Wolf Lord attached. Even at their higher points cost than what they were, they're still being spammed regularly and are a handful to deal with. For their named characters, Bjorn the Fell-Handed is nice, Ragnar Blackmane is absolutely savage with all of his damage 2 attacks, Logan Grimnar can do some big rerolls, and Wolfen is still worthy of play at 95 points it seems with their damage 2 hammers, even if they don't do objectives. Usually for a bunch of strength beyond Thunderwolves though, there's usually a bunch of other Space Marine units there, often some fire support like Vindicators or other things, plus a bunch of objective support units such as Infiltrators, Scouts or Jump Intercessors perhaps. There do seem to be quite a lot of different approaches there though. In general they don't really seem to be doing so bad right now though. Thunderwolf heavy lists might have their weaknesses of being screened out, or maybe being a little bit obvious in just having to move up to the enemy and they try and deal with it, though often that's not going to be the easiest thing to do. In general though, in terms of game balance, they don't seem to be in the worst place in the world. I suspect a fair few people are kind of wary about getting into them though, given that they've got a suspected model update coming sometime in 10th. Next up, we've got the Sorcerous Might of the Thousand Sons. They seem to be sitting on win rates of 48%, so dropping a couple compared with last time around. I've won a tournament and placed highly once since the last update. They're still really quite a niche faction to put on the table at 22nd out of the 27 armies, though for the players who are playing them, they're doing alright at breaking into the top tables of Warhammer 40k, around about 15% of their players able to, and that puts them a very appropriate 9th out of 27 there. In general, their armies haven't really changed so much after the last balance update. They didn't really get any specific Thousand Sons changes so much, and unfortunately their Hex Warp Thrallband that they got was one of the weaker Grotmus detachment, and no one's using that versus the Cult of Magic in competitive really. They've still got some very powerful rules to put on the table, even if their units do pay a premium for them. Cabal of Sorcerers can give you a bunch of Doombolt mortal wounds, double move shenanigans, or save debuffs. Potentially things like double Doombolt can be absolutely savage with certain enhancements and thrown out a long way with Mutalith beasts. And the Sorcerer's firepower can be pretty nasty in themselves as well, with things like Infernal Masters with devastating wounds, or the other Sorcerers with the enhanced things. In general, Thousand Sons lists remain fairly cookie cutter as a result, seeing as not much has changed. Magnus in Pride of Place as a big linchpin for very fast moving massive damage, a pretty great focus of buffs and stratagems too, then backed up by multiple more squads of Rubric Marines with Warp Flamers backed up by Sorcerers. They can be really nasty in the mid-board, particularly with Overwatch, and even more so with Infernal Masters. Pretty much all the Sorcerers are pretty efficient and well balanced, including Ahriman, and then usually there's some Mutalith beasts to support with some heavy lifting and some extended range on Doombolt, plus some cheap chaff to run around and score and screen. Things like Zangor Enlightened or Cultist may be the most popular, though regular Zangors can work okay too. Overall, it seems like they're in a fairly well-balanced place at the moment. In terms of criticisms, it feels like their Scarab Occult Terminators still seem to be sitting on the sidelines, and there doesn't really seem to be all that much debate as to which lists work well at the moment. Magnus just being utterly auto-include, and a lot of conversions on other choices beyond that, even if it's not exactly like they have tons of datasheets on offer. Next up, and also on 48%, are the Orks. That's plus 1% from pre-update, so fairly similar there. As mentioned though, they seem to have been absolutely tearing up the tops of tournaments recently, either 9 event victories or 5-0 undefeated runs since the balance update, which was largely due to one huge weekend where they got no less than 5 GT wins all at once, and also using a range of different detachments on top of that. Otherwise, they're usually a popular faction, though certainly remaining so at the moment at 6th out of the 27 most played. And they also do seem to be one of the most reliable, making their way onto the top tables of tournaments, at 16% of armies making their way up there, putting them at 5th out of 27. In general, it looks like the average Orcs player is kind of doing alright, but they're certainly one of the strongest factions out there to get you to win a grand tournament or place in the top tables. In the last balance update, they had some important changes. The war was declared at the start of the command phase, so your opponent won't be able to see it coming every second game now. The regular war boss got raised in points, though is still great, though perhaps most importantly of all, they gained Breaker Boys and Tank Busters, giving Orcs some serious anti-tank firepower and melee now, and they're being used in a whole bunch of competitive lists, and perhaps very best of all, they gained the Tactical Brigade as well, which now seems to be very, very strong, perhaps the single best Orc detachment out there. Orky orders for big damage and some extra resilience against enemy shooting. Big Hunt was also buffed a little bit too, though it doesn't really seem to have been enough to see wide adoption for the Beast Snagger one. For detachments being used in competitive play at the moment, Tactical Brigade does seem to be the most played and also with the best win rates. People found it really quite fun, as well as it being very effective on the board. Warhorde's the next most played one, and then some use of Green Tide, Bully Boys and Dread Mob, all of which are doing okay but not quite as standout. For their most notable units, a good chunk of the Orky list is rather scary, usually with a good amount of melee mites jumping out of trucks or transports, Breaker Boys, Regular Boys, Knobs and Beast Snagger Boys, generally led by War Bosses or Beast Bosses, all very scary, particularly with the extra damage of the War. Orky shooting has really taken a hike though, where flash kits were already really quite efficient before, but certainly in Tactical Brigade they go absolutely next level and can flatten most things with that mech attached, and Tank Busters similarly give you a seriously strong anti-vehicle shooting unit, and even better in Tactical Brigade with the orders as well, which makes them very efficient against elite infantry too. Otherwise, Gretchen are rather nice for sitting around farming command points and having some cheap units for actions. Storm Boys can do some secondaries. Casgul plus Meganobs is usable in a whole bunch of detachments, and Meganobs in themselves are really good in Bully Boys. Then as mentioned, some efficient transports to get them around, trucks and battle wagons for the main melee stuff, maybe some kill rigs if you want some Beast Snagger Boys on the go. Overall, seems like Orcs are in a relatively good place right now, generally doing well enough with their average list, and multiple ones doing well at tournaments. Tactical Brigade does seem to be the standout one though, and I guess for criticisms of the faction it feels like the buggy datasheets and maybe some of the walkers are still feeling a bit overshadowed by the rest of the choices. I feel like if Games Workshop wanted to rewrite one chunk of the Orc rules, making the buggy datasheets more impactful and scary would be a big win. Next up, and moving on to the Space Elves, we've got Index Aeldari. The Codex has only really just got its tournament legal points, so it remains to be seen how that'll get on. I suspect that they'll be doing rather well though. The Aeldari have win rates of around 49%, which is pretty similar from pre-update, one big 5-0 event win or undefeated run. Sort of middling play rates in tournaments, though seemingly a bit less likely to reach the top tables than the average faction. They didn't really get too much in the way of balance changes in the last time around before their codex. The only update they had was the Armoured War Host, and that was just flatly behind the previous Battle Host, though given the changes maybe it'll have at least a little bit more draw in the new book. Pre-Codex Aeldari had a whole bunch of staples for a long time, in particular massive amounts of damage from anti-tank weapons with their Battle Host rerolls and the Strands of Fate to sub in some auto 6s to Overwatch or devastating wounds. Both of those are no longer really a thing though, and plenty of their strong units have had their abilities switched around as well. As a result, maybe not worth going quite so much into it, but in the Codex there's plenty of things looking really good. Aspects with Phoenix Lords and Wave Serpents look like they can deal some horrendous damage. There's that big Guardian Death Star that people like to talk about a lot. It looks like it could be pretty dangerous and fairly hard to engage for a number of reasons. Good movement tricks from Battle Focus on some powerful units, Inari looking nice and particularly with Ivrain as well, and some efficient scoring units to jump around the board as well, maybe with some Scorpions and Rangers in the mid-board to fight for that. Overall, I think most people are expecting for new Aeldari to be pretty strong, and I certainly wouldn't be surprised to see them winning some tournaments. From Space Elves to Space Dwarves, and next up we have the Leaguers of Votann. 49% win rate, so a little bit lower than pre-updates, though not by much. One big event win or 5-0 undefeated run. I still played about a similar sort of amount to before at 18th out of the 27 factions, though are an army that seemed to struggle to break into the top tables more so than most, at only 10% there, placing them 23rd out of the 27 Warhammer 40k factions. That does often seem to be the case with index leagues of Votann really, a lot of big damage and defense but less sneaky tricks, and that seems to mean that they just have fewer top event wins compared with the amount of people that play them and the amount of people that win with them. In any case, they still have their core mechanics with the judgment tokens for the +1 to hit and wound, marking a bunch of big threats at the start of the game as perhaps the most important way to get them out, and then most of their stratagems are pretty big hitting damage and defensive ones, though Void Armour did take a nerf along with the other Armour of Contempt stratagems, which was quite a big deal for things like Einhir Hearthguard and the Hecaton Land Fortress being shot. Otherwise, Thunderkin went down a little bit, though it doesn't seem like too many people are taking them even so. And they got their Grotma's Hearthman detachment, again that was seen as one of the very weakest ones out there. In general though, after several waves of balance passes, most of the units in their army are usable enough, usually Sagittor spam with beam cannons with some Hearthkin or Chthonian Berserks inside, usually a couple of Land Fortresses with conversion beamers, one unit of Jaegers to screen the midboard, some Pioneers to run around and provide some autocannon goodness, and maybe some Einhir Hearthguard or Brockier Thunderkin to support in smaller squads perhaps. In general, they're still just waiting for their codex and for the support that any other units that they might get might bring. In general, beyond that, will just be remaining a big hitting damage and defense style army until then. Next up, we've got the World Eaters at win rates 49%, again unchanged from pre-update there. They seem to have been doing okay at big event wins. 4 tournament wins or high placings there. They're played about middling for Warhammer 40k, 13th out of 27, and also seem to be fairly middling as a faction for breaking into the top tables on events. They're still pretty much 40k's melee murder army, usually with enough damage to kill whatever they need to, amped up by extra speed to get there from Blessings of Khorne, or maybe yet more damage if that's going to be easy. In the last balance changes, not really all that much happened for them. The Grotma's detachments gave them Vessels of Wrath though, which perhaps seems like one of the best balanced ones given that both people are using Vessels of Wrath and the Berserker Warband now, and both having fairly good success with either of them. Kind of nice to see that Vessels of Wrath is actually being played and some players are choosing not to take Angron, which means that it's now a tiny bit more of a maybe choice rather than an automatic auto-include. I feel like that's nice enough to see to give World Eaters players another viable way to play. In the Berserker Warband though, and still to be honest in Vessels of Wrath, he is still very usable. Moving fast, hard hitting, and then a good chance of coming back when he's dead, a big problem unit. And then otherwise they can have massive great big scout moves with Lord Invocators or a ton of 8-bound. Lots of units taking up threatening positions that can't be ignored. Berserkers and Rhinos can be extra nasty on the mid-board objectives, often with Khan or a character to lead them. Jackals can sticky some objectives and also be fearsome enough in their own right. And then maybe for allies, Wardog Carnivores or Brigands could be interesting for some fire support, and their Forge Fiends and Lord of Skulls aren't unusable either. The Vessels of Wrath list seems to just go very heavy on Berserkers and 8-bound units, maybe often using the unit champions as the vessel models. Overall, they seem to be in a fairly good and violent place right now. 2 pretty usable detachments to choose from and pretty much all their unique stuff very viable. Maybe Khan the Betrayer still feels a little bit on the costly side to me, and it looks like their codex won't be too far out in the next few months or so. Moving on, we've got the Genestealer Cults, who were pretty much the single strongest army in the game prior to the last update. It does appear that with Games Workshop restricting the amount of drops they can get and a few other choice nerfs, they have been brought right back down to more balanced levels though, now winning 49% of games rather than 59 or so. They're still doing alright at grand tournaments though, with 3 event wins or undefeated placings. Their 17th out of 27 faction play rate is actually kind of high for them really. Maybe a fair few people getting interested when they were overpowered and dusting them off to put them on the table, and they're still very playable, so that's continuing. And I still look like they're adequately good at reaching the top tables too. As mentioned, 40k's guerrilla warfare army got a whole bunch of changes with the last balance update, mainly cult ambush working very differently, so it's more a set number of things auto-respawn now, as opposed to every unit having the chance all the time. And otherwise beyond that, a collection of small nerfs: Outlander Claw, the Kelemorph's reactive move, the 3-inch deep strike from the Host of Ascension. The Ridge Runner and Abominance both went up in points costs, though they did get the Final Day Grotmus detachment, which some people are putting on the table to some success. In any case, between that little lot, and perhaps in particular the Cult Ambush change, it does seem to have put them down to more reasonable levels of power. Overall though, with their detachments, they still seem to have some of the best detachment balance out of 40k. Pretty much all of their options are usable in their own way, maybe the Brood Brothers one just being weaker than most. It does look like the melee hard-hitting Biosanctic Brood Surge is better than the majority, with boosts for Pure Strains and Aberrants. The Host of Ascension is still very general purpose, really nice for core neophyte damage combos, and can deliver melee threats well as well. Final Day is a new entry with the Vanguard Tyranids, maybe not having quite as much out-and-out power, but loads of unit choice and lots of unit rolls to fill the right thing. And then Outlander has good support for the bikes and transports. Otherwise, beyond all that, the Achilles Ridge Runner, despite a points increase, is still an absolute staple datasheet, handing out an AP debuff wherever it's needed, and their transport vehicles are still very efficient for delivering either acolytes or metamorphs into the game. Overall, good to see them in a pretty well balanced place with a lot of different viable playstyles. I still rate them as maybe one of the higher skill factions to play, just with the sheer amount of options and needing to make sure that your big punches land home. And perhaps even more so than before, you now need to think about which units are going to be respawning and when a lot more carefully, as opposed to just rolling for them. Finally, for the units being talked about in this tier, we have the Admech, also win rates of 49%, one big tournament win or 5-0 undefeated run, pretty reasonably good at breaking into the top tables of the one game defeated or less, though as per normal still one of the lesser played factions of Warhammer 40k, 20th out of 27 factions for play rates at grand tournaments, though even that I'd say isn't actually all that bad for them at all. And I feel like the Halo Screed detachment has maybe tempted a bunch of people to put them on the table once again. For their balance updates, the Castellan robots just got a touch cheaper, though the biggest change was adding the Halo Screed detachment, which is the one where the Tech Priest can sort of assume direct control of various different units out there. It has a whole bunch of really interesting handy buffs that you can put on various different things, and it's just quite nice to have a detachment that will support Skitarii things well enough, but also stuff like Castellan robots and Cataphron breaches. And it does feel like one of the most general purpose detachments out of what they have, and also seems to be one of the strongest as well and most played in tournaments. Overall, it does seem like it was a pretty good feeling one. The Skitarii Hunter cohort is the second most played now rather than the most played one, though both of them are doing adequately well in terms of performance still. Again, for the most part, the vast majority of their datasheets are very usable and certainly in the right detachment. The Battle Line Vanguard and Rangers are pretty much required for the buffs they can put on other units. Both flavours of Taraxi are nice enough for scoring. Infiltrators are really common to be used to screen. Now the Scatrot is cheaper, it can have some actual genuine lone operative utility use, even if its damage output is not much. And Taser Dragoons and Rust Stalkers can hit hard for melee. For anti-tank with big guns, perhaps the Scorpius Disintegrator is one of the most standout things, though Iron Striders with their twin las cannons are still good. And as ever, the Cataphron Breachers with the Tech Priest Manipulus attached are a bit of a standout as well, particularly in Halo Screeds, though also can do well in Rad Zone Core. In general though, there seems to be a much better place for Admech versus what they were before once again. It feels kind of worlds away from their codex really, and nice to have a bit more incentive to run a good mixed list with some Skitarii and some other units too. They're still never going to be a particularly widely played army though, with the expensiveness of their models and the difficulty of painting them up to put them on the table too though. Moving on and sticking with pretty well balanced factions at the moment, these are the ones that appear to be on 50 to 51% win rate. Maybe compared with the last ones sort of pushing the upper mid tier as opposed to the lower mid, though in reality pretty much all winning around about half and half of the games. And out of these ones for top tournament performance, it seems like in particular the Ultramarines might be striking out above their win rate for the top event things, and the Blood Angels and Death Guard are doing rather well as well. In this tier on 50% we have Drukhari and the Space Marines, they're both on 50% win rate, and then we've got Tyranids, Grey Knights, Death Guard and Blood Angels all on 51. Jumping into those ones, and first up we have the Drukhari, win rate's 50%, which is slightly improved on pre-update, just the one high event placing, and I believe that was Mr. Scary at the LVO. Really quite low play rate at tournaments at the moment, 23rd out of the 27 factions, though for those players on average they are doing rather well at reaching the top tables, at a big 16% there, which is 4th out of the 27 factions, which I guess isn't too bad on that metric. It was interesting that after the balanced data slate there was really quite a lot of doom and gloom for Drukhari, though it seems that at least on the competitive scene it's the Grotmus detachment, the Reaper's Wager, which at the moment is looking like their single strongest detachment in terms of both power and in terms of the amount of people that are playing it, though Sky Splinter isn't all that far behind. The points changes maybe weren't ideal though, more nerfs than buffs, and to a fairly mid-tier faction, maybe the Scourges going up 10 points was probably the biggest thing. The Reaper's Wager just has a lot of really good ways to get Drukhari melee units into combat and fighting hard. In theory, the idea seems to be that you balance the rerolls between the Harlequins and the Drukhari units, though the majority of Reaper's Wager lists seems to be going really heavy on the Drukhari units, and only taking, say, a troop or so for the Harlequin side of things. So very much keeping the focus on buffing the Drukhari units rather than trying to make Harlequins work in a massive way. I guess there's at least some chance that might change though, given that the Harlequin datasheet's got a fair bit more threatening. Inbuilt devastating wounds for the troops at least seems fairly interesting there. Otherwise though, within Index Drukhari more generally, the vast majority of units are really quite usable right now. Talos are strong, Kronos are nice in small numbers to farm pain tokens, Beastmasters can scout and disrupt in the midboard, Cabalites and Venoms can sticky some objectives, Archons and Incubi or Leaveth Witches in a Raider can both hit really hard in Sky Splinter. Mandrakes are quite nice for secondary objectives, Scourges are still good for jump shooting, and other things like the Helions and Reavers are still solid too. There's certainly more usable stuff than otherwise. I feel like maybe just for faction health of Drukhari out of their 3 detachments, maybe having the sort of allied one being the strongest isn't really ideal for them. Not every Drukhari player necessarily wants to throw some Harlequins in, even if he can make the army work with a very small number of them. It doesn't look like there's any hard news as to when Codex Drukhari is going to show up in 10th edition yet, hopefully not too far in the distant future. Will be interesting to see what they do with the faction then. Moving on though, and the standard Adeptus Astartes are quite nice to see not at the very bottom tier of these power and win rate metrics. Space Marines rose up the rankings from 45% up to 50 in general, though I feel like that kind of hides a bit of a trend of the Ultramarines just absolutely doing great at grand tournaments. It looks like they've either placed highly or outright won 17 big events so far. And even with being the most played faction in Warhammer 40k, very slightly over the Necrons, that's still really quite massively overperforming. In particular, I noticed there were a whole bunch of Ultramarines lists that managed to make their way into the upper echelons of the LVO. When taking Space Marines more generally though, they're breaking into the top tables on a sort of average kind of rate, 13th out of the 27 factions and 15% of players getting there. Though I really do feel out of the Space Marine data it looks like it's basically Ultramarines and the rest. If you took Ultramarine data by itself, it would probably have a higher win rate and an even better ratio of tournament wins to the amount of players, whereas the other Space Marine chapters, while not really being crazily far behind, just don't really add so much. So from a pure competitive level, there's not really as much reason to play them versus Ultramarines, even if dedicated fans have occasionally been making them work. The balance changes last time around were rather enormous for the Space Marines. They had the Armour of Contempt nerf, the huge Oath of Moment buff with a +1 to wound, Guilliman going up in points but also allowing free stratagems and double oath. That was kind of massive in the context of it going up. Calgar and Ventress got points rises, but it hasn't stopped the Ultramarines, and both of those are still present in competitive lists quite a lot. A whole bunch of datasheets got some big rules glow-ups, maybe Sternguard Veterans being one of the more interesting of those, allowing just enormous damage rerolls against an Oath target, and being really nice with fighty characters on the side. They have the Librarius Conclave, which is occasionally used but still seems kind of niche for the Librarian-focused detachment, and they also had the nerf to Fire Discipline, which toned down Gladius a bit. In any case, for competitive detachments, a fair few things are working still. Gladius Task Force, Ironstorm Spearhead, and Vanguard Task Force all seem to be the staples still. And Firestorm is still usable but maybe not having quite as much success. There was one tournament won by a Librarius Conclave as well, I believe. In general, for notable units, the majority of those lists do seem to be running Guilliman, given his enormous Oath damage boost, plus his stratagem things. In particular, he works really well with Space Marine tanks with those. Calgar and Ventress are both really quite good though, and Vanguard Spearhead lists with just those two have often been a thing as well. For tanks, most of the Space Marine armour is really quite powerful and really deadly with the +1 to wound on the go, maybe with the Ballistas, Dreadnoughts and Vindicators in particular having a bit of a good run recently. Then plenty of Astartes objective grabbing units, things like Infiltrators, Scouts, Intercessors, Incursors, Company Heroes and Combi Lieutenants, all bringing their own things to the table, either grabbing secondaries or escorting characters and things. And then quite a lot of the other stuff might vary detachment to detachment, more armour for Ironstorm, maybe some potentially teleporting Devastator Centurions or Inceptors in Vanguard Spearhead potentially. Overall, nice to see Space Marines actually having some proper draw to them over the Divergent chapters. That has been one issue for them literally all edition long at this point. It does maybe seem to have thrown up the challenge though of trying to balance the other core Codex chapters versus the Ultramarines though, which still seems to be throwing the rest of them in the shade. Moving on, we've got the bugs from beyond the galaxy in the Tyranids. They've got win rates of around 51%, so about the same as they were pre-update, just 1% higher. Despite also being a really widely played faction, as the 4th most played of the 27, they have only had the 2 big event 5-0 runs or victories, and again are kind of middling in terms of making their way into the top tables at a 13% there. The last balance changes had some token things for them. The Norns got a little bit cheaper, the Tyrant Guard got a touch cheaper against their Warrior Bioform onslaughts, and the Assimilation Swarm got quite considerably better to the point where a few more people are trying it out. Between all that, it feels like the Tyranids are in at least a fairly good state of balance. Their Battleshock Shadow in the Warp is relevant against some armies, and there's at least a few datasheets that can capitalise off failed tests like Neurolictors, and the +1 strength from Synapse Beasties was helpful to some, particularly things like the Norn Emissary. Out of detachments, it's the general purpose invasion fleet with the big damage buffs that seems to see the most play still and is doing rather well. And then for detachments after that, there's quite a lot of good balance really. Crusher Stampede, Vanguard Onslaught and Assimilation Swarm all being played in good numbers and having alright success. Then some people trying out the Warrior Bioform one, but to a bit less success. Synaptic Nexus seems to have fallen off a bit, maybe partly due to their Armour of Contempt equivalent being a bit worse than it was, and the Unending Swarm after the nerfs to that is still pretty much unplayed. For standout units, the vast majority of the Codex is really quite playable. Maybe the Exocrines and Tyrannifex often tend to be staples for some big gunfire support. Maleceptors are okay for the front line. Hive Tyrants can buff a bunch of that with lethal hits plus advance and shoot as well. The Lone Operative Lictor variants are really nice. Gargoyles are nice for some fast moving objective control, plus their movement tricks, as are the other Endless Multitudes. Eurotyrants are nice and could back up Zone Throbes. The Norn Emissary is a big tough staple, particularly now at strength 10. Being cheaper doesn't hurt either. And Biovores still have really quite nice value for secondary work, putting one model down in the home field and then spawning out those spore mines to do certain secondary objectives or screen out the enemy. The vast majority of things beyond that are really quite usable though. There's maybe only a few things that really feel like they're a bit underpowered, perhaps the Toxicrin, the Flyers and the Spore Assist being some of the best examples, and otherwise the faction feels like it's in quite a good place. Maybe still having a slight problem with things that can damage and destroy enemy monsters and vehicles, besides things like mass lethal hits Exocrines or the Tyrannifex. Next up, and also on 51%, we've got the Grey Knights, which rose up quite a bit from the 45% or so that they were on pre-update. I must admit that did feel a bit of a strange thing with Grey Knight balance. It looked like they didn't really get any worse and then just dropped down from around 50% to 45% for a few weeks, and now suddenly seem to be right back up to 50% again, though admittedly in quite a different form with their Purified attachment. In terms of play rates, they're around about 15th out of 27 factions, so a tiny bit on the lower end but kind of middling-ish. They've only had the one outright event win or high placing with 5 wins undefeated, though otherwise look like they're a faction that tends to break their way into the top tables a bit more likely than some of them, at 16% there or 6th out of the 27 40k armies. The big things in their last update were Dread Knights going up a tiny bit, some big nerfs to the teleport force with the 3-inch deep strike nerfed and true silver armour being worse, but they gained the Purified attachment and the Warpbane task force with the big damage rerolls for a bunch of units. While they might not have quite as many teleport tricks in that one, they still have the standard warp units around the board which can get them where they need to be, and they get really big damage rerolls within your zones of control, or if they're nearby a Purify squad that can provide the bubble for other units. It seems that has been enough to make the Warpbane task force absolutely the right way to play Grey Knights right now. Basically the vast majority of tournament going armies are running that detachment, and they are doing so with a fairly certain subset of units, Very heavy use of Dread Knights and potentially Grandmaster Dread Knights as well. Lots of psychic firepower and potentially melee as well that they get to reroll the hits for. Some purifiers to be able to provide those hit rerolls, and also have a nice stratagem or two to help them out. And then in particular the purgation squads seem to have become a thing. Lots of lists using several units of those with psi cannons buffed up by the hit reroll buffs as fairly general purpose shooting that can potentially shoot things out of line of sight provided something else can see it. Otherwise, most of the rest is still usable. Terminators or Paladins backed up by characters, maybe Cald or Drago delivering them into melee. Interceptors are nice and fast moving, and Strike Squads are good for some sticky objectives in small numbers. It does kind of feel like their two detachments are kind of badly balanced though, after both having a new interesting one and then also having some nerfs to the previous. Feels like the teleport force caught some flack for things aimed at other things when it wasn't really a problem in itself. In any case, at the moment, Grey Knights seem to be doing alright right now. They don't seem to be massively stand out on the top tables. Moving on, and also on 51%, we have the Indomitable Death Guard. 51% win rate, which is -2 from pre-update, though do remember they started out this one with some very low win rates. I wonder if they might slowly creep up a little bit higher than this over time. Otherwise, their other metrics look rather good. They're being played 7th most out of the 27 factions, which is all very appropriate for Nurgle. They've had 6 big event wins or undefeated runs, a couple of those at the LVO I seem to remember. Definitely on the upper end of factions in general there, and more of them are breaking into the top tables compared with most, at 15% there or 10th out of the 27 armies. Otherwise, for their gameplay, they still have the big debuffs with -1 toughness, and then bonus contagions for either extra AP or -1 to hit as needed. The balance changes in the last one didn't really change all that much for them. Mortarion gained Deep Strike, though it's not always an option that really makes sense to make use of, and they had a tiny Predator Annihilator buff like a few of the other Chaos factions. For the detachments used, it still seems that the vast majority of people are using the Plague Company. I think one person went undefeated with Flybone Host since it came out, which I saw. For the most part, it does look like people are sticking with the regular index detachment though. Otherwise, for their army list, there's a few staples. Typhus is in just about every list, as is Mortarion for the most part. They usually have a good amount of Demon Engines and Predator Destructors for the fire support purposes, maybe some Bloat Drones or Mephitic Blight Haulers perhaps, or occasionally using things like War Dog Brigands. Otherwise, Carnivores are another popular choice for some fast-moving, hard-hitting melee and objective control. Nurglings are nice for screening and disruption, and then Plague Marines and Rhinos are another staple with the Biologist Putrefier and maybe a Foul Blightspawn. Between their damage combo, particularly with the sustained hits bonus, they can potentially do a whole load of damage. Deathshroud Terminators are also absolutely immense for the stats as well. Very slow moving, but just great melee damage output and really quite hard to take down. Overall, still looks like the Death Guard are doing rather well, as I think most people were predicting, given that they were in a good place before and then they didn't really get any worse. Looks like they've got good performance both on an overall win rate and also top tournament sort of stats. Finally, for this section, we come to the Blood Angels, also on 51% win rates, which is kind of unchanged from prior to the update, and similar to the Death Guard, they've been doing rather well on the high tables of events, either 6 event wins or undefeated runs with 5-0 or better. They're the 10th most played army in Warhammer 40k, and have sort of a middling chance to reach the top tables at 14% there. For the balance update, they had the normal Space Marine stuff with a bunch of datasheet changes, in particular Stern Guards in combo with any character can be a ridiculous melee unit in their own right, never mind any devastating wound shooting they happen to do. Otherwise, Sanguinary Guard got better, going down 5 points when they were already strong. Mephiston and the Rage-Fueled Warrior Captain both went up a tiny bit, both still playable enough though. They had the nerf to Armour of Contempt, which might have hurt their datasheets a little bit. They have the new Angelic Inheritors detachment, which seems like the closest rival for the Liberator Assault Group type one, and you can make a weird Blood Angels list that takes absolutely 0 Blood Angels unique datasheets and get the +1 to wound from Oath of Moment, which is rather brutal in combination with the damage buffs that Liberator Assault Group can get anyway. A few people seem to have been messing around with that weird combo. For detachment choice, basically everyone still seems to be playing Liberator though, anywhere between 80 and 90% or so. It still feels like the one with the most raw power, though those people using Angelic Inheritors also seem to be doing okay, needing to build around some big units supported by characters, though it's kind of interesting that they can buff both shooting and melee, and they do have some interesting stratagem options. One of the Angelic Inheritors lists placed 3rd at the LVO as well. Otherwise, for good datasheets, provided you're not trying to ditch them to get boosted Oath of Moment, Sanguinary Guard with Dante or Captains are really quite efficient, and are very good just on their own too. Death Company in a big block with Lamarties are all very nasty. Regular assault intercessors are absolutely great, and particularly with captains, potentially with that rage-fueled warrior combo that can absolutely wail on the vast majority of things that are on an objective. And jump intercessors are still great for scoring and pretty brutal on the charge. Scouts with combat knives with AP-1 are extra savage in Blood Angels as well. A lot of lists do seem to have been running them with a good bunch of Space Marine support units with gun tanks. Things like Vindicators or Predator Destructors or Ballistas Dreadnoughts. It seems that a lot of lists are choosing to run some of those to back up all the melee things. Overall, still looks like they're doing broadly really quite well. Still perhaps an army that forces some big decisions though, as to whether or not you commit your massive melee units to a given target and having to really weigh up whether or not they can kill something or not. And otherwise probably their main downsides are their detachments and units that just don't really see all that much play. The Angelic Host and the Lost Brethren were kind of clearly far weaker than the Liberator Assault group just when the Codex came out. It'd be nice to have a bit more draw to them. And there's still plenty of their unique data sheets that are kind of underpowered. The Sanguinary Priest feels a bit overcosted for what he does, and the Death Company Dreadnought and the Captains rarely see tournament play. I feel like some points drops for them wouldn't be the worst just for internal balance sake. Overall, they're certainly bringing the melee violence, and are definitely a strong army in 40k right now though. Moving on though, we're getting to some of the stronger factions by win rate. These guys are 52 to 54%, definitely on the upper end of the meta, and we've just left one faction till last. Even these guys though aren't exactly that far ahead of the midpoint, and all are absolutely beatable. A strong army played well out of one of the factions with lower win rates can absolutely take victories against ones of these. All of them do seem to be doing solidly well at the tops of tournaments, maybe the Custodians and Knights generally having a slightly higher win rate versus their top tournament performance, though that seems to be normally the case for them. It does mean that at least some of these, for some of their detachments, might get some nerfs in the future though. Compared with the rest of Warhammer 40k, they're perhaps sticking their heads above the parapets just a tiny bit. In any case, for these guys, on 52% wins, we've got the Astra Militarum, Deathwatch and Adeptus Custodes, and then Necrons on 53, with the Imperial Knights up on 54. First up, we've got the Astra Militarum, and this will be for their index currently, given that the Codex hasn't become tournament legal yet. We're likely to get the points cost for those sometime within the next 2 weeks. They've got 52% wins, which is -2 compared with pre-update. They were very, very strong and one of the strongest factions in the game previously. But Games Workshop hit them with a massive amount of point increases, a whole load of their tournament staples went up, and Lord Solar Leontus went up to 150 and had his order scope reduced. It maybe felt like the tank units and scout sentinels and things seemed to be some of the things that were most left unscathed. In any case though, for their other stats, they're still winning lots of events. They've had either 8 wins or 5-0 undefeated runs, which puts them in the top 5 on the tournament outright victory type things. They're the 5th most played faction in the game, and in terms of the amount of players reaching the top tables for taking them to tournaments, they place 2nd there, with an 18% chance of just losing 1 game or less. Perhaps the main reason for that though is the Bridgehead Strike detachment, which seems to have taken over as the strongest way to play Astra Militarum. That was the Grotmus detachment that they got, and it seems to have maintained their strength in the face of a bunch of nerfs. It seems that at the moment Bridgehead Strike is used in around about a third of games, but is doing far better than Combined Regiments to a fairly ridiculous extent on the win rate sort of metrics. Bridgehead Strike, when taken alone, has around about a 65% win rate versus around about 45% for Combined Regiments. Bridgehead Strike is the Scion focused one, big damage buffs with +1 to wound and things for Scions that drop in, and then other really nice supporting abilities for them, things like stripping cover, having them jump around the board, and all manner of other stuff. I feel like it's not the sort of list that literally every guard player can put on the table though, as you need a lot of Scions to really make it worth it. So not really surprising that a whole bunch of people who want to play their tanks and things are sticking with Combined Regiments, which while still a bit deflated in the tournament stats, isn't unplayable. For notable units in Bridgehead Strike, it's Scions, Aquilons and Kazakin in big numbers, with some supporting units. I've seen a few lists using some mortar batteries with Creed as well. Combined Regiment lists tend to be using Lord Solar and going tank heavy with lots of Rogue Dawns, Rosses, tank commanders and some Sentinels to spot things. The vast majority of the rest of the Codex is useful in all sorts of different ways, and a fair few lists are using Gaunt's Ghosts to bounce around for secondary objectives. All this is shortly to be kind of history though, with the new guard points and units coming in. We already know the 4 rules of the Codex, and it's likely to get its points cost within the next 2 weeks. Will be interesting to see which detachments remain on top. Scions are going up a bit for Bridgehead Strike, but Kazakin look like they're getting better, and plus there's a bunch of other interesting detachments to throw into the mix as well. The Mechanized one and the Hammer of the Emperor for tanks as well both look interesting, unless Games Workshop decides to quite radically shift points costs compared with where they were when they announced them with the Codex. It does look like the Astra Militarum are still going to remain a strong army in Warhammer 40k going forwards. Moving onwards, and next up we have the Deathwatch. These guys have won around about 52% of games since they've returned to Warhammer 40k, sort of not really existing prior to the update, as they got their full faction status back, with their supplement index coming back as one of the Grotmus updates. As a result of having a fairly different unit lineup with some different Primaris kill teams to what they had before, not that many people have been playing them. They're around about 25th out of the 27 factions, only higher than Sisters and the Imperial Agents there. But they have had some pretty notable success, including 3 5-0 undefeated runs or event wins or better, most notably including Mark Hurtle at the LVO. That certainly attracted a massive amount of attention to the faction. I'm sure that a fair few people will be giving them a try in the tournament scene in coming weeks. Otherwise, it also seems that they're better than average at making their way to the top tables, 7th out of 27 factions there, with a 16% chance of going X1 undefeated or better. As mentioned, their last update basically returned them as a full Space Marine sort of supplement faction, as opposed to 4 datasheets in Imperial Agents. In particular, when coming back, they had their Primaris kill teams and the Terminator squads return. The Primaris kill teams are really quite efficient datasheets, like the Talon Strike and the Indomitor one, and the regular veterans led by Watchmasters are rather good as well. But their Terminator squads are just very efficient with their weird triple cyclone missile launcher loadout. I'm really not sure why that was pointed at 180 points. It does seem rather good compared with the regular variety. Having quite so many threatening and actually effective kill team units mean that their special issue ammo stratagems are more useful, plus they've got their teleport stratagems from the Black Spear. They did have a small nerf to that recently though, where it locks the actual damage buffs for the mission tactics to the kill team units only. Though that doesn't really seem to be the biggest deal in the world. It certainly wouldn't have affected the Las Vegas Open winning list all that much, given that that was basically entirely kill teams. Beyond that, they also have some good enhancements as well. The Beacon Angelis and the Tome of Ectoclades are both really nice, and in particular that Thief of Secrets is a really nice fighty relic, could be good with a Judas Ear or basically any other Space Marine fighty character like a Captain. Maybe for Deathwatch, perhaps the biggest challenges are with big blocky 10-man units, meaning that you need to make really quite big decisions. If you lose them without gaining enough from their value, then you could have things go south very fast, and while they're really quite dangerous, they're maybe not extraordinarily tanky for the points cost. They might have a few less units than some armies as well to do secondary objectives and run around doing stuff. Otherwise though, it looks like it's a pretty triumphant return to form for the Xenos hunting Space Marines. Nice to see them in a strong position. At the moment though, I wouldn't necessarily say that they're overpowered or anything like that, but do look like they're one of the stronger Divergent Space Marine chapters along with Blood Angels. Next up, we've got the boys in gold for the Adeptus Custodes. They're also on win rates 52%, which is up 3 from their previous things pre-update. They're one of the very most played factions in the game, as they often are when they get good. Lots of people have got access to them, given that they're just really quite cheap to get into and easy to paint up. And for top tournament performance, they've either gone 5 games undefeated or won events 4 times, and are around about middling with breaking into the top tables at 15% there. Custodes certainly have their standard playstyle, with big hitting things on a 2+, massive tanky saves with 2+ armour and 4+ invulnerables, and then Martial Qatar to help them out in melee with all their Guardian Spears. In their December updates, the Virtus Praetors actually genuinely became a good unit once again, which is nice to see. They'd been far too weak for far too long really. People are genuinely using them in competitive lists once more. And they also gained their Solar Spearhead detachment, and that does indeed seem to have been enough to make their Dreadnoughts actually genuinely scary and a powerhouse part of the army list. For the armies that are being played in competitive, it looks like the Solar Spearhead and Shield Host are the most played. I guess quite a lot of people still liking detachments that don't require massive amounts of expensive Forge World, and Talons of the Emperor still got a good showing as well. It looks like out of those, the Solar Spearhead does seem to be ahead for wins. Custodes Dreadnoughts moving fast, hitting hard and walking through walls will do that. They've got around about 56% of wins or so, though it's not ridiculously ahead of the others. For their staple units, Wardens with Blade Champions are often the best things for battle line infantry at the moment. Perhaps one unit of Custodian Guard with Kyria Draxus for some very scary shooting. Caladius Grav tanks are fast and efficient gun turrets for taking down enemy heavies, with a few small scoring Sisters of Silence to grab objectives and secondaries. As mentioned, Virtus Praetors are genuinely seeing some play at the moment, which is really nice, offering in small units of 2, and they can get some fun stuff from a bunch of detachments, and the Venatari with their rapid ingress things are also good. In Solar Spearhead there's certainly likely to be a good number of Caladius tanks, but otherwise it seems like the dreadnoughts of choice are the Telemon heavy dreadnoughts backed up by some regular venerable contemptors from the Codex. Looks like their revive on death rule to keep them alive and kicking and fighting is enough to draw people to play those rather than the Forge World versions. Overall, looks like the Custodes are in a fairly good place, definitely an intimidating army to see on the other side of the tabletop, though as ever maybe not quite dominating the top tables in the same way as some other factions despite being quite such a widely played army. They seem to be doing alright there, but maybe a little bit less so than their other stats might suggest. They do have a bit of a reputation for having a bit of coasting off their sheer numbers and stats, and they can be a tiny bit less subtle than certain other armies out there, perhaps limiting super clever plays, though obviously they can still get results and you can definitely play them either well or badly. Next up, and moving up 1 percentage point above the rest, are the Necrons. It looks like they're on 53% after the dawn of the Star Shatter arsenal, and that's up 2% from prior to the update, and again their other stats are rather good. They've had 8 different event wins or 5-0 undefeated runs. They're one of the better ones for making into the top tables, and they're the second most played faction in competitive games in grand tournaments right now. The balance changes that they had quite a lot of smallish points nudges one way or the other, though didn't really change things to an enormous level. The biggest changes were more to Hypercrypt, which got nerfed in terms of the numbers of things that can teleport around, and also the 3-inch deep strike thing got worse. There was a small buff to Annihilation Legion that doesn't really seem to have changed huge amounts in terms of competitive play for it, though really the star of the show was the Star Shatter arsenal, the Grotmist detachment that people basically reacted to as being the single strongest one really. It does seem to have been adequately so that Games Workshop even decided to drop an emergency balance patch for it, raising the cost of a couple of the stratagems and making one of them a bit less reliable. Prior to the nerfs a few weeks back, it did seem that Star Shatter Arsenal was vastly more played than the other ones, and around about double all the rest combined. It does maybe seem that the other ones have gained a little bit of ground in terms of people taking them up after the nerfs happened, though Star Shatter still looks like it's the most played as well, and it still seems to have been holding its own in performance-wise. It doesn't look like the nerfs have killed it or anything, and is still probably one of the very strongest ways to play Necrons. The main rivals at the moment looking like they're the Awakened Dynasty and the Hypercrypt Legion. After several waves worth of points adjustments, the majority of Necron units are still looking rather strong. They've got some nice small scoring units like Flayed Ones, Deathmarks, Lone Locust Destroyers or Scarab Swarms. Interesting troop combo things that you can do with maybe Immortals plus characters, Imitate the Stormlord maybe with some Lich Guard to rustle up some command points, Scorpec Destroyers and Lords maybe in Awakened Dynasty, Monoliths or other super heavies in Hypercrypt, and Catan themselves are still pretty immense as well, big stat checks that the enemy often can't kill. In the Star Shatter arsenal though, perhaps the two most vocal units are the Silent King and Doomsday Arcs, both being really quite efficient data sheets that you can put the detachment buffs on. Maybe Hexmark Destroyers to carry enhancements to help them out, and the Canoptek Reanimator can be a really good unit as well, potentially allowing a vehicle to double reanimate on an objective for an extra 8 wounds. That could be incredibly intimidating on the Silent King. Otherwise though, despite the stratagem increases though, it still looks like Star Shatter and Necrons in general are in a pretty good place. Winning plenty of games and doing well in tournaments. Maybe a few more lists might be tempted to take both Imitate the Stormlord and Zarek in the same list, even if that's not exactly very lore friendly. It's certainly helpful enough to have those extra command points for those more expensive but very good stratagems now. Finally for this section, we've got the Indomitable Paragons of the Imperial Knights. They're up at a big 54% win rates, up 4% from previous, being one of the most consistent armies to reach the top tables of events, 17% of their armies going X1 or undefeated, and that makes them the third most on that stat out of all of 40k, maybe not quite as big on the actual event wins and things, maybe partly with their reputation as an army sort of like Custodes that perhaps lacks for the higher level play just a bit at the absolute top levels of the game. It seems that they've been played a sort of middling kind of amount, 16th out of the 27 factions. They seem to be in a fairly good spot before, around about 50% wins or so, though Games Workshop just threw them a surprise buff with a drop of 10 points on Warglaves and Helverins, both already very strong units, and it meant that a few more lists might have been tempted to go heavy on those guys, and at the very least have some points left for an extra squad of agents, or maybe encourage, say, more Warglaves and Helverins and fewer Titanic Knights. They also got their Allied Admech detachment, though that didn't really get played at all. In any case, Imperial Knights are big, strong and dangerous. Lots of vehicles that certain armies might struggle with if they don't have enough anti-tank on the go. The Code Chivalric for rerolls to hit and wound, a 6+ feel no pain that gets better if you slay the Warlord, and plenty more fun strats. It looks like some of their higher placing lists are indeed doing a bit of armiger spam now. Perhaps a few more armies, say taking just Canis Rex and a whole bunch of armigers, or one of the other Titanic Knight variants, at least compared with the sort of 2 or 3 Titanic Knights plus support that we were seeing before. Most of the Titanic Knight data sheets are still really quite usable and good though. Canis Rex with his big damage and free stratagems, the Atropos and the Lancer Cerastus ones are nice, the Errant is pretty good, and most of the other big ones are usable like the Crusader or Castellan. And then usually, kind of similar to the Demons, it often makes sense to take at least some allies along, maybe a Calidus Assassin to bounce around doing secondaries, perhaps a cheap Minister and Priest for 40 points, or some cheap squad of Imperial Agents. At the moment at least, it still looks like they're probably not performing crazily high on the absolute top tables of the game. They look like they'd be an absolute menace at a more sort of casual level, particularly at a sort of RTT or casual game level. You may be more likely to run into armies that just can't really handle the sheer amount of armour and huge amount of damage that they can spit out, and it does look like they're going to remain a very powerful army going forwards. That just leaves us with one though, and it seems that the faction with perhaps a good argument to be top faction in Warhammer 40k right now are the Chaos Demons, sitting a couple of percentage points clear at 56% it would seem, and it does look like they've got rather good win rates and pretty huge success at big tournaments. Even with this though, it's not like they're crazily overpowered or unbeatable. They're very far from the sort of 70% win rates that Aeldari were getting at the start of 10th edition, and only just outside of Games Workshop's previous targets at the sort of 45 to 55% things that they previously said in the past. Here we have them on the list, sitting just a bit higher than the Imperial Knights for win rate metrics. For the Chaos Demons, they already had quite a good win rate before at around about 53, which has moved up to 56 or so now. And it looks like that also correlates with their tournament performance as well. 9 events where they've either won or gone 5 games undefeated. It does appear that they are the single faction with the biggest chance to reach the top tables as well. First out of the 27 factions there, beating out the Guard in second. And they're being played around about 9th most out of the 27 40k factions right now, which I feel like is kind of impressive for them given that there's a bit of uncertainty as to their future in the current 40k Codex update cycle. For the balance changes, they got a few light touch things. Bloodletters went down in points a bit, the 3-inch deep strike became a 6-inch for their incursion detachment, and Screamers got a bit pricier but more dangerous. They did have an update as well that for some reason buffed the Demon Incursion detachment in a pretty big way, allowing them to do a 6-inch deep strike drop and still charge with units now for 1 command point. That is kind of crazy and something that basically no other army in the game has access to, so just kind of mad that that's quite so easily available for a 1 command point stratagem, and you don't even need to coordinate with the Greater Demon auras. Really though, the big star of the show is the Slaanesh detachment, the Legion of Excess. They got their 4 new Grotmus detachments added in, which do look like they might be suspiciously in lieu of a codex for 10th edition. All 4 of them are at least seeing some play and some success in tournaments, though the Slaanesh one really seems to be absolutely next level. On win rates, the Legion of Success appears to be performing much better than Demon Incursion at around about 65% versus 48%. And it just gives the various Slaanesh Demon datasheets absolutely massive damage buffs, with rerolling all hits and wounds provided they choose to fight second, which sometimes can be a big deal but sometimes not, say if you're going up against shooting units and trying to take apart tanks and things. Even against melee things, you can often afford to take a punch if you charge the right thing, and particularly units like Keepers of Secrets and Fiends of Slaanesh, they do have enough wounds to take a bit of damage and then still trigger those mad damage rerolls and still work out as being the best option. For the Legion of Slaanesh lists, it looks like Fiends are the biggest mainstay, often lists taking multiple maxed out units of those. Otherwise, just basically everything else in Slaanesh is reasonable enough for support, usually at least 1 Keeper of Secrets, maybe Celeste and some Demonettes, perhaps Shalaxi Hellbane, or some Seekers for some scouty things. And then Chaos Demons in general have a lot of good staples. Nurglings, Beasts and Plague Bearers are all quite nice options for scoring in particular. Be'lakor can be rather nice against gun lines to just turn off shooting for a turn. And most of the rest of the Greater Demons are really quite playable, particularly in the Incursion detachment, wandering around and delivering other things into melee range when they want to, plus just being really big beat sticks in their own right. The Great Unclean one with the Endless Gift is also just really great value for his cost as well, with that 4+ feel no pain, basically just guaranteed near enough not to die or your opponents wasting their time by killing him. In any case though, it does look like Slaanesh Chaos Demons are one of the armies to beat in 10th edition at the moment. It's not like Incursion is really all that bad, even with a bunch of players migrating to that one. Looks like the Scions of the Dark Gods are in ascendancy at the moment, and look set to do quite well until the next balance update. They do maybe have a bit of a counter in not being anywhere near as good against really strong melee armies though. Needing to not take up fights first to trigger their big damage rerolls means that you might be able to get in some serious damage ahead of them if you've got scary melee units of your own. In any case though, let's just wrap up a few numbers for the video. Here are the number of Grand Tournament event wins or 5-0 or better undefeated runs. There were quite a lot of those at the Las Vegas Open, basically the equivalent of winning a tournament in its own right elsewhere, so I feel like they deserve to be counted. And as mentioned, it's the Astartes on top for this one, almost double the amount of anyone else. Orks and Chaos Demons next, followed by Astra Militarum and Necrons, Death Guard, Blood Angels and Chaos also doing well here. Out of the non-Imperial Agents factions, it looks like it's only the Sisters that haven't had one of these yet. I was interested to see how they rated per play rate as well, particularly given that Space Marines have got quite such an overabundance of players. It looks like when rating them per the amount of people who put them on the table, it's actually the Deathwatch that pip out the Space Marines for achieving some good event wins for the numbers of people taking the faction. Those Space Marines are still right up there despite being the most played faction in the game. That really shows just how strong Ultramarines are, given that not every Space Marine player plays Ultramarines. Then after that, again we've got Chaos Demons and Orks up there, and Guard and Blood Angels, also a good showing for Chaos Space Marines as well, despite fairly low win rates. Bear in mind that there will be a fair bit of randomness in this one though, just due to the amount of grand tournaments or undefeated runs being kind of low in general. Otherwise, here's the list of play rates. Space Marines, then Necrons leading the way here, with Custodes, Tyranids, Guard and Orks following along after that. Quite a lot of that's at least fairly expected with the amount of people playing each army. Maybe Custodes being a bit higher than they'd usually be if they weren't quite strong right now, perhaps. Otherwise, Sisters might be kind of niche normally, but they're exceptionally low at the moment in terms of player sentiment to put them on the table. And otherwise, for normally lesser played armies, it feels like Admech and Genestealer Cults are perhaps being played a bit more than normal, even if they wind up kind of low in the table, even despite that. Then here's the list of the stats for the amount of players breaking into top tables, only losing 1 game or 0 games across a grand tournament, so maybe having a bit more reliability of data given that there's a lot more of those. It looks like Imperial Knights rise up the rankings really quite a lot here, maybe being an army that seems to be better at going 4-1 than 5-0 perhaps, and Drukhari with their Reaper's Wager seem to be doing quite well here, even if they haven't really been winning events so much. Otherwise, on the lower end of the spectrum, it looks like it's Chaos Knights, Black Templars, Leagues of Votann and Chaos Marines that struggle more for this metric. Not quite so many armies of those on the top tables versus some of the things at the top of the list. Finally, here's the overall win rate chart once again. As mentioned throughout this, not really the worst game balance that 40k has seen. Pretty well 25 out of 27 factions within the 45 to 55% win rate target, even if certain detachments can break out of that a bit. It may feel more of a case that certain detachments might be a bit overpowered as opposed to whole armies. Perhaps things like Bridgehead Strike and Legion of Excess and things might be breaking the mould a bit, even if the rest of the players playing other more general purpose detachments perhaps hide the win rate of those a tiny bit. Again, I suspect that Ultramarines will look quite impressive here as well if taken alone. Overall, while there's still definitely criticisms that you could make, broadly it seems like the game is in a fairly good place. Pretty much most of the armies being able to play and win against most of the rest, at least with a good player taking a strong list. I wouldn't be too surprised if Chaos Demons might be heading for some sort of nerfs in the near future, maybe the Imperial Knights as well, and fingers crossed Games Workshop manages to help out the Sisters of Battle in the next update. They, along with the Imperial Agents, really seem to be the ones that are most in the need of it. In any case, certainly looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say. Feel free to let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Finally, for the end of the video though, I'll just cycle back to the Magnet Baron in the video sponsor. As mentioned previously, the suppliers of magnetic bits and components for 40k kits based in the USA. For a quick whiz through what they have to offer, one good thing is this magnetizing starter bundle. This one gets you a pin vise drill along with a good selection of drill bits, some magnet applicators, some glue and a whole bunch of different magnets to get you started. Not the worst starter kit all in one place rather than looking around for them individually. Just in general, they've got a whole bunch of different magnets of virtually any size and shape that you could want, and their magnet applicator tools for not sticking magnets together with super glue are definitely one of their more popular items to actually get them onto miniatures and not stuck to your fingers. They've got loads of different 40k themed kits, including certain clever 3D printed bits like the Ignite kit. Quite fun to be able to do that with no drilling whatsoever. That one's got a whole bunch of clearly done instructions that take you through the process of making that one work. But they also have a slight raft of more straightforward ones as well, with say similar sort of kits but with more just the magnets included, maybe a couple of other bits for things like War Dogs, Monoliths, Invicta Warsuits, the Archaeopter or the Rogue or Dawn tank, and a bunch of other 40k units that you might want to magnetise. Beyond that, they've got magnets that can fit flush under bases that you could use for storage type things. And as mentioned earlier, a bunch of flight stand type things, another real common application of magnets for things like Inceptor stands and stuff like that. I've certainly done a fair few magnetised flight stands myself. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check them out, links down in the video description if you do want to get some neodymium in your life. In any case, I'll leave that one there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.